So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this TDI Sustainability Masterclass webinar on sand and silicates, organised in partnership with the Global Centre for Mineral Security. So sand and other silicate materials are the world's most mined solid raw materials. They're fundamental for everything from construction and transport infrastructure to industrial manufacturing and energy production. But their importance and the environmental, social and governance issues associated with their abstraction are often critically overlooked. So in this webinar, we'll be exploring some of the issues associated with the excavation of sand and the supply chains affected. We'll provide an update on the outcomes from the closed-door partner session on advancing responsible business conduct in sand and silicate supply chains held recently at the OECD Forum, and then also subsequent follow-up meetings. The next steps that are being taken to develop due diligence processes and frameworks and how you can get involved. So the speakers will also discuss what industries reliant on sand and silicate materials should and can be doing now to engage in the due diligence process and reduce their risk exposure and their impact on the environments and the communities from which the sand and raw materials they're using are being sourced. So today's facilitator is my colleague Clara Sagam. Clara has more than 15 years of international experience in improving the sustainability of extractive industries. Clara previously worked as a sustainability and stakeholder relationship manager at Imris, one of the leading global players in sand and silicate mineral processing and supply. And welcome to all of our other speakers who are joining us today for our panel and Q&A. So we're joined by Dr. Louise Gallagher, who is a senior fellow at the Global Centre for Mineral Security within the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland. She co-leads the Responsible Sand and Silicates Initiative with Professor Daniel Franks and Daniel Home. This new initiative will be formally launched in 2025 and is building on a partnership with the OECD, IKEA and Rocket Group to ensure the responsible sourcing of sand and silicates. We're also joined by Julia Manise. Julia is Standards and Certification Lead at the Solar Stewardship Initiative, the SSI, and is part of the SSI's Secretariat. The SSI is the first ever supply chain sustainability assurance scheme dedicated to the needs of the solar PV sector. Julia is responsible for the development and implementation of the SSI standards covering environmental, social and governance and supply chain traceability issues applicable to the full silicon value chain, from quartz mining through metallurgical grade silicon and polysilicon to ingots and wafers through to cells and modules. And then finally, Leda Langberg from Statkraft. Leda is a lawyer with more than 15 years of experience in compliance and sustainability advisory. She currently works as a senior advisor in sustainable procurement at Statkraft, where she supports the company's procurement team in identifying and mitigating social and environmental risks across its diverse supply chains. Leda is also the current chair of the Supply Chain Sustainability Workstream at Solar Power Europe. And Statkraft is Europe's largest generator of renewable energy, including production of hydro, wind and solar power. So welcome and thank you very much to all of our speakers for joining us today. So on the screen, you can see the agenda for today's session. We'll start with a brief introduction from Clara, followed by our panel discussion with all of our speakers. And finally, we'll end with a Q&A session where we'll put your questions to the panelists. So please do keep your questions coming in throughout the session using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll collate those questions as we're going along. And thank you also to everybody who submitted questions when they registered as well. We've got some of those ready for the speakers to answer as well. So with that, I'll hand over to Clara.
Thank you, Sarah. I hope you can hear me well, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to kick off today's discussion by shining a light on something perhaps seemingly ordinary, which is sand. And when we think about critical raw minerals or materials, sand and silicates rarely come to mind. And yet they are the most mined solid materials on Earth, with over 50 billion tons extracted every year from marine, river, and land ecosystems. So sand is everywhere and is quite literally the foundation of our modern world. It is in our buildings, roads, cars, and even in solar panels and smartphones. So just to illustrate, sand and gravel are the backbone of cement and asphalt, vital for construction and infrastructure. Flat glass in windows, cars, and screens relies on high purity silica sand. In metal casting, sand shapes molten alloys into tools and parts. Brick making also uses sand to improve strength and texture, and it's even used for land reclamation and beach nourishment. When it comes to technology and the energy transition, silicon from sand is what enables solar panels and microchips. But I guess the growing demand for these applications raises a question, which is why we are here today. And this is, what are the environmental and social risks behind this invisible backbone of development? And that's the hidden risks we'll be exploring today, and also how industries and government can respond. Now that we've seen how important sand and silicates are in everyday life, let's talk a little bit about the risks, especially from an ESG perspective. So firstly, sand mining often causes habitat destruction, erosion, and loss of biodiversity. Taking sand from rivers and coastlines can damage ecosystems and make the land less stable. It also affects water security. Removing too much sand can lower the water table, leading to water scarcity, salinization of groundwater, and even saltwater intrusion, which can damage farmland and infrastructure. Also, in places where mining is informal or poorly regulated, there are serious health and safety risks for workers and also communities. Traditional jobs like farming and fishing are often lost as land and rivers are damaged or become unsafe to use. In some areas, the sand trade can weaken local governance and even involve corruption, violence, and coercion, especially where there are the so-called sand mafias. Degrading rivers also make them less resilient to floods and extreme weather, increasing the risks during storms. And finally, the industry can widen wealth gaps as profits are often made by a few, while the local communities bear the social and environmental costs. So these are just some of the ESG challenges linked to sand, and they are growing as demand continues to rise. So why should businesses pay attention to sand and silicates? Well, firstly, regulatory pressure is growing, and laws like the EU CSDDD and the German Supply Chain Act are expanding. And while sand hasn't been the focus yet, it won't stay outside the spotlight for long. There's a real reputational risk. NGOs and journalists are already investigating abuses in sand extraction, and if companies wait to react, it might be too late. So from an operational and financial perspective, unstable or unethical sourcing can mean delays, fines, and also losing investor trust. In addition to this, stakeholder expectations are changing fast. So today, investors, buyers, and business partners want full ESG transparency, not just for high-profile materials, but for everything in the value chain, including, in this case, sand. And finally, there is an opportunity here. Companies that act early can lead the way, can help shape future standards, and can build stronger and more resilient supply chains. So with that, let's move on to our panel session. Welcome, Luis, Leda, and Julia. I'm going to start with a round of questions for the experts. And if it's okay, I'll start with you, Luis. So first of all, I wonder if you can describe the work underway to develop the due diligence processes that are required for sand and silicates to give our audience a bit of background.
Yeah, thank you, Clara. Thanks to TDI and to Sarah for the opportunity today. So I come from the Global Center for Mineral Security, and one thing that's good to know about us is we operate with the perspective that minerals security is what we do when we consider that people really matter. So we have to consider that responsible minerals production is a great boost to us, to our societies. Irresponsible production also can come with consequences for us all. So from that background, it's probably worthwhile just letting folks on the call know that I came in from the environmental perspective from UNEP, which had begun some work on sand and sustainability, I think as early as 2014. And Daniel Franks, who many on the call probably knows, led the work on development minerals at UNDP. And then building off of that, we've been on a journey for the last number of years, prompted by IKEA, who came to find us with some questions around what is our relationship to these materials. We're very far down the supply chain. We have this material across our product line, everything from ceramics, glassware, kitchen countertops, the buildings we're in, the electronics, the list goes on. Just, is there something we could start to do? We have these muscles built up on supply chain due diligence from all our other activity, and we're ready to apply them to this material. And when we looked around, there just wasn't an obvious choice, with the exception of the OECD due diligence guidelines. So from that, we thought we would go to the OECD Forum, which happens every year, the OECD Forum on Responsible Mineral Supply, and just ask the question, is anybody else thinking that it might be time to start talking about responsible sourcing for these materials, for all the good reasons, Clara, that you mentioned in terms of scale, our dependence on them, the volumes are huge, the volumes of what we consume and extract are absolutely massive, and now the risks. And from that, we got into a great conversation with the OECD itself around the need to start to map the understanding of the OECD due diligence guideline risks to these supply chains. It's not that the guidelines can't be applied to this material, it's just they're not applied as regularly or maybe as in a shared way and discussed as openly as what we would like. So from 2023 to 2024, we were in conversation about how to consider these risks, how to start to think and talk and frame them, because it's quite diverse. They cut across many different sectors, many different types of supply chains, long and short, and simple and interconnected, global and very local. It's very diverse. So we produced together a baseline study that maps our understanding of the best knowledge we have out there on risks related to these supply chains to the OECD due diligence guidelines as they are today. So looking at the Annex 2 risks, for those of you who work with those guidelines, you'll know what they are. For those of you who don't, it's those concerns with human rights, corruption, bribery, these types of questions. And the OECD have also produced in 2023 a new environmental handbook. So now we have an additional list of risks to look at, from biodiversity, climate, water, pollution, dust, air quality. And then there are a third category, sort of a flexible category of other systemic risks. So we've been mapping for about a year now those that our understanding, and the news, I guess that's good to get across today, is every single one of those risks we can find some example or evidence of for in the supply chain. So the data that's out there is telling us that the OECD supply chain due diligence guidelines are relevant for this material, and we can start to use them. So that's one big message that we got across last year. In that process, we've been taking people on a journey with us. So we've been having waves of companies coming to join us through the OECD Forum and through connections. So now we're up to, I have a long list here in front of me, but MCS Group, I'm here today in their facilities in Portugal, actually. Roca Group, which you heard mentioned earlier, WWF have joined us from the beginning, Wholesome. Mercedes-Benz in 2023 did the first inclusion of silica sand in a raw materials report for the automotive sector. So they became part of the gang pretty quickly when we realized how far ahead they were. So we've been on this exploration together for about a year, and we've gotten to a point now where we realize there is a lot to do. There is so much work to figure out exactly how to start to apply what we have today and adapt it and adjust it for the differences that this material can imply. And that's what the coalition is really about. We're forming into a trusted group of very diverse companies from across the supply chains, including the ecological demand that is necessary for these materials in river environments, marine environments, dynamic environments. Sand does a job for us. It is shaping those environments. It is the habitat. It is purifying water. It is storing water. It is literally protecting our coastlines. So we make sure to represent that group very clearly in our collective. And we are now at the point of formalizing into, I think, the first group that's going to try this together to learn lessons on how to do supply chain due diligence, find the gaps, start to share knowledge, and start to lay down a pathway for others to follow. So that's it in a brief nutshell, what we've been up to. Literally, the OECD Forum earlier this year made the case at a global level for why a coalition is necessary. And then we just met last week in Barcelona to figure out what that coalition is, who it's for, what it's going to do, and we've come out with good answers.
Thank you so much, Louise, for sharing these key outcomes from the recent OECD session and your meeting in Barcelona. There's a huge amount of work that has been done, and I was just wondering what has been the biggest challenge so far when it comes to building alignment across sectors.
Yeah, actually, I was just at lunch with MCS, who was with Sofia Bautista, who's the co-CEO here. And we were saying what was surprising to us was that we had so much alignment last week in our group. So yes, we have very different sectors, but we're bound by these materials. We're connected by the materials more than we realize. So a very different, diverse bunch of people got into a room last week in Roca's beautiful gallery, expecting to find a lot of differences. And what they found was more commonality. We're all responding to big context changes, of course, the uncertainty that's in the world. So we shared that. So we found alignment in the material, in the desire to work together. Where there are maybe big differences will come down the line as we get into those very specific sectors. Like I mentioned before, for every rule you can make up for these materials and the supply chains, I can find exceptions for you very quickly. They're long, they're short, they're global, they're very local, they're very complicated, they're very simple. So we will have to differentiate, I guess, the experience of people at different points in these supply chains and different geographies. But I still feel there's more holding us together than there is separating us on this point.
That's good to hear. Thank you so much for this contribution. I am going to jump out to invite Julia to answer the next question. I know the SSI is setting ESG standards across the solar value chain, but sand is clearly a key raw material for this sector. So where does extraction of sand and silicate fit within the current SSI standard? And also, what do you see as the SSI role, or where does the SSI fit into the due diligence processes for sand and silicates that are being developed by the multi-stakeholder initiative being led by Louise and her team?
Thank you so much, Clara, and hello, everyone. Those are definitely important and timely questions. And ultimately, solar cell sort of begins its life as quartz, which then is transformed to become silicon, which is the key material for making solar panels. And it's really a pleasure to be invited to this session to share more insights from the Solar Stewardship Initiative and how and what we've been doing so far when it comes to quartz mining and looking into the silicon value chain. Just a few words about SSI. So it's the first multi-stakeholder supply chain sustainability certification scheme, which is dedicated to the solar PV sector. SSI formally opened for membership at the end of 2023. And it comprises now over 50 members, which include buyers as well as manufacturers of module cells, wafer ingots, and polysilicon. And together they represent more than 70% of globally shipped solar PV modules. And SSI, and I think there is definitely some correlation to what Liz was describing earlier, SSI cell was also created more or less in response to growing demands, which were coming from civil society, policymakers, investors, and industry to ensure overall greater transparency, more accountability, due diligence when you look into the solar PV supply chains. And we so far have two standards, which are the foundation of SSI system. One is a standard covering ESG, environmental, social, and governance topics, and the other one is looking into supply chain traceability. And those standards apply to the full silicon value chain, starting from quartz mining through metallurgical grade silicon, polysilicon, to ingots, wafers, to cell and models. And our members have to go through certification mandatory to both of those standards to manufacturing members. And when it comes to due diligence, I can sort of also partially echo what Luis was mentioning when we're looking into what type of requirements to set when it comes to due diligence and responsible sourcing. The instrument which we all looked at and is basically OECD due diligence guidance. And that's also one of the key components in SSI assurance system in terms of requiring manufacturing members to implement the OECD due diligence guidance, to develop their due diligence management systems, which are reflecting of the expectations in the guidance and applying, race-based due diligence to their supply chain. And obviously, SSI has been new, but we've been working on positioning ourselves as an assurance program for the solar value chain, for the silicon value chain, but actually capturing the upstream, capturing what is happening at the quartz mining. This is definitely a challenging part, and it's area which is still emerging. And I would say from the where SSI stands now, relatively limited in scope at the present, because our ESG standard is very much focused and is intended more on the manufacturing part of the silicon value chain. And there, as we're looking to further, how can we explore the due diligence processes for quartz? How are we able to see what measures our members have to take in place to address those environmental concerns, human rights abuse, and other issues at the quartz mining upstream? This is where we definitely see a lot of importance on collaboration with multi-stakeholder initiatives, and like the one which is driven and what Luis was updating us about, because it doesn't seem to be possible to actually deal with it in isolation, especially because we are talking about such material which has for a long time escaped attention and was considered to be low value, low risk, and nobody was really, putting a lot of resource and attention to it. Therefore, we do see that looking into that, how can we harmonize the efforts and collaborate towards ensuring more transparency and responsibility when it comes to quartz mining as one of the, activities which also SSI wants to continue engaging with, and work with our stakeholders, our peers, and other initiatives on how can we, put more focus and more attention to what is happening upstream of the supply chain.
Thank you, Julia. You mentioned that one of the categories of membership of SSI are buyers. And I was wondering if they are or they have started asking questions about the sourcing of sand that is used in solar panels.
Yeah, so I think that obviously as more and more emphasis goes to as a need for downstream companies to do due diligence on their supply chain, they are definitely starting to ask more questions what is happening upstream. But this is also where it is getting more and more challenging to get that information, because a lot of also in SSI program, quite a lot of buyers, they have a good understanding in terms of who are their first tier suppliers, who are their direct suppliers. Then obviously for a big part of the industry, if we look at specifically for the solar, quite a few manufacturers are vertically integrated, which gives a bit easier job to understand, okay, you got to who is making models, who is making cells, who is making wafers, and who is making ingots. Where it's starting to get way more opaque is at the time when you get to the polysilicon and metallurgical silicon, and obviously what is happening at the quartz mining level. Also because the quartz mines in particular have not really been subject to a lot of scrutiny by any other existing programs, even though there is a number of standards, mining standards, which focus on mining, and in theory, quartz mines would fall within their scope, as quartz has never got attention in comparison to what is happening when you look at gold or cobalt or lithium or nickel. Those schemes also have not been really looking into checking or seeing what is happening with the quartz mines. So even though our buyers are clearly seeing the need to have more information and start engaging with their upstream suppliers, it's definitely not an easy task in terms of being able to identify those and have some kind of in terms of interaction to make sure that we're getting this information and seeing how we can manage those risks upstream in the supply chain. And that's why this type of collaborative action, and not only, even though SSI is a group of companies who came together with other stakeholders to create this program, I think that looking at all the challenges associated with doing due diligence upstream, that needs to go beyond SSI, and actually, especially thinking about that, sand and silicates, in our case, quartz, are actually used across so many different industries. And then I think we should capitalize on that, forming more collaboration and partnerships to actually promote responsible sourcing.
Thank you so much, Julia. This is very interesting. And I was wondering, as part of the SSI Secretariat, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative, what would be your advice on managing the risk of fragmentation of approach to be avoided? As you mentioned, this is a topic that needs collaboration across sectors, across multi-stakeholders. I wonder then, how can the risk of fragmentation of approach can be avoided?
Thank you. I think it's a relatively difficult question to answer in terms of what is the silver bullet solution which can help us to address fragmentation. But definitely, I think it's very important to not to try to create a solution in isolation, to look into how we can create those baselines for across multiple sectors. How can we enable more interoperability between different, assurance systems? How can we sort of work also on capacity building of the upstream versus just coming directly with a set of requirements? Also seeing how can we work together in terms of building their capacity. And I think this type of also forum we are having today is really great opportunity to see also what is happening, what other initiatives are happening. And I would say that we hope that the conversation about sand and silicates and responsible sourcing of those will continue also at the next OECD Forum with even more concrete steps involving multiple stakeholders.
Thank you so much. I agree. And hopefully when we get to the questions from the audience, we will also start to see what are their concerns, what are their challenges, what are they needing more support, and guide us towards finding solutions in collaboration. I would like to move on next to a question for Leda. So Leda, what steps have and can companies engage in the development of due diligence processes for sand take?
Thanks, Clara, and thanks for the opportunity to be here, and to my fellow panelists. I think it's a really timely topic, actually, and in the renewable sector, for us, we see that it touches all of the technologies that we work with, all of the construction projects we do, and of course the solar sector as well, in a different way. But I think, to echo the other panelists, what can companies and buyer companies like ourselves do to complete the due diligence around these types of materials? And I think it always starts with the OECD guidelines, right? And it starts with accurately identifying and assessing the adverse impacts, both in our own operations and construction, and also in our various supply chains. And I think for own operations, most companies manage that relatively well. We're getting better at that. We have to report on it now. So that's not the crux of our challenge. But it is the supply chains where it gets significantly more challenging, because we have such diversity within all of the different places where sand and silicates appear in our supply chains, and particularly for an operator like ourselves. You know, we're not just involved in solar, we have these big construction projects in hydro, we have a lot of metal forging, etc., that's used in various technologies. We have all sorts of different places where sand and silicate touch our supply chains, and trying to manage all of those diverse sources feels very overwhelming from a sustainability perspective for the practitioners here. And so the promise of the collaborations, particularly upstream, to develop things that will help us in all of those supply chains makes the most sense, right? To not do it on a kind of technology basis. But when we implement ourselves the OECD guidelines within our own processes, you know, we have needed to really, in practical terms, take a very technology-specific approach. We've had to look at each technology separately to understand where sand and silicates touch those supply chains, and to try to understand where we think we would need to prioritise risk, where we think the biggest adverse impacts for people and the environment would appear in those supply chains. But it's not necessarily obvious, and so we're really hopeful that the more transparency we can produce further upstream, the better we'll be able to understand those supply chains ourselves. It's more obvious to us the shorter the supply chain is, so that makes sense. Where a good example is our construction projects in the Nordics. Often we source very locally sand and silicate materials for those construction projects, and I think there it is easier to manage the adverse consequences because we can see it and better understand it locally. And I think the opposite is true of the products we buy, where there are products we buy that have used or incorporate sand and silicate materials. That's where it's not obvious to us where the adverse impacts necessarily are within that supply chain. And so that's why we're really hopeful about the promise of further collaboration to provide that insight, because we can't dig into all of those individually as companies. It's simply too overwhelming. So very hopeful here.
Thank you. I was actually thinking about that word, overwhelming, because I think it's one of the concerns and the challenges of the audience that we have here today. So it's good to know that there are tools available to start that due diligence process journey, such as the OECD guidelines, like you explained. And I was also wondering if you have seen examples where companies were able to turn this challenge into either innovation or leadership.
Yeah, I guess the challenges we've talked a little bit about already. I think in terms of innovation, we don't have really concrete examples yet. But we're certainly seeing a space around circular economy initiatives where we think that there can be risks that are really reduced. So there is an opportunity within those spaces to produce sand and silicate materials or aggregate materials or whatever the material that's needed is, to produce them with much lower risks to people and the environment if they're done right. And that sort of innovation, I think we're very excited about. So we're seeing, you know, examples in the Nordics of recycling of aggregates, for example, in various processes to reuse some of those very big volume materials. And I think that's really exciting because not only are the processes less labour intensive, they're often a lot of automation, etc. So there's real opportunities to reduce risk on the human side, on the social side, but also from an environmental consequence. It's obviously not having ecosystem impacts in the same way that digging an enormous mine might have. So I think we're very excited about those opportunities within the spaces to help us make really good decisions in the future. But that feels some way off. But nevertheless, it is aligned with, in particular, in the EU framework and the direction that several initiatives within the EU system are focused on. We think that's a really exciting area of opportunity. But the challenges still remain. There is real complexity from a buyer perspective, particularly when you have so many different supply chains that we're talking about here. It's very hard to generalize, right? So the challenges are in that complexity, and then the challenges are around the increased expectation, not just from regulators, because that is a bit political and ebbs and flows a little bit, but for us also investors. We're 100% state-owned entities, so from the Norwegian government and indeed civil society as well. We really want to meet those expectations and feel the weight of that. But as they start to ask questions about these very complex supply chains, we're less ready to answer. So I think we're very hopeful about the innovation, and we're very hopeful about the collaboration, and we're hoping that those two things together will help us fill the gaps and meet the expectations.
Thank you, Leda, for sharing. I think it was great to understand the challenges, but also for you to explain that not everyone is just starting on this. Some companies have already started and they've applied innovation and opportunities when it comes to circularity. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on to the next question, but of course, Julia, Luis, Leda, feel free to jump in the answer whenever you want to complement what your peer panelist is adding. So when it comes to, perhaps for Luis, when it comes to construction, industrial minerals is the key sector when it comes to use sand and silicates as raw materials. But what construction sits slightly out of the usual sight of players involved in the OECD guidelines on responsible mineral supply chains? So where do you see the construction industry fitting into the process?
Yeah, great. So we have Gilbane Building Company in our coalition. Each of our members is sort of holding space for us to represent a certain sector. So I'm not quoting them directly, but I'm just letting people know where I'm picking up my understanding from. So of course it's aggregates as well as industrial minerals. It's very complex, like Leda mentioned, the diversity. If you think for 1 minute what a construction firm is absorbing, it's flat glass, electronics, unbound aggregates with concrete. So it's absolutely massive. So the role is really critical here for the construction sector as a big volume downstream consumer who has some influence, but it is very complicated for them back into their supply chain. I know they don't look like the usual suspect that comes to the OECD Forum, but I wanted to make a point here that maybe for Ronald on the Q&A as well as relevant. The OECD guidelines, Ronald asked, so, they're developed in the global north, do they work for the global south? What I've learned about those guidelines is that they're reasonably sensible, like, do you know how to identify risks? Are you doing that? Have you got some kind of management system in place? It's all about how they're interpreted in place. That's where it's actually really complicated, so the guidelines themselves are pretty sensible and straightforward. What we need are like those experiences working with them to kind of come back, feedback, and let us all know how that has worked, because the data gaps are pretty big. The context does matter hugely here for this material. The diversity, like we've mentioned, will have an effect. So for the construction sector, I think it's really vital they get involved. There's space within the OECD guidelines. There's space within the forum. It's a very welcoming place. I feel like I'm sort of selling OECD for them. They don't need probably the help from me, but it's been my own experience as somebody who doesn't come from the traditional mineral sector that I felt really welcome there. It's a place where people come to start to talk about problems and start how to find solutions. Like Leda, what you're describing, the overwhelming feeling, that was remarked upon last week in our session. But then at the end, people said, this is tricky. It's really complicated. I feel like I know certain parts very well, but I see people around the table who know other parts of this better than I do. And that gives me a lot of comfort. So we have to start to learn together and start to share what we know about what the best practices look like. And I mean, that's another question that's here. Are the best practices set out? I'm going to say, kind of like they're in niches. We have little niche best practice people who are innovating already, who have figured out something, who are starting to share ideas, but we don't have a place necessarily yet to bring those learnings together. So that's what my view of the construction sector would be, is like it has to be part of that niche. They are niche innovators. Some of them are doing good work on this, but we just haven't heard about it yet. And we just need to figure out more what they're actually doing.
So I'm going to close the session asking you one more thing, which is, what are the next steps for the Responsible Sand and Silicates initiative?
Actually, I'm going to bounce off one of the Q&As that are here from, I think it's John, about the insights from the OECD closed door session about consensus or divergence among participants on what responsible sourcing of sand and silicates should look like. That's precisely the question that came up last week. We feel like the first step here, a sensible step, and maybe it's part of the solution to the fragmentation, is to come together and figure out exactly what do we mean, and not to treat that question lightly. What do we mean when we say responsible sourcing or responsible sand and silicates or responsible production? Because it looks a little different from place to place, as we know, from sector to sector. The challenge in that, to answer John's second part of the question, there are some red lines that are very blurry right now. In some contexts, are there some practices that we'd be willing to treat differently compared to others? You know, that whole red line question came up for our group last week. So they want that first year to be a scoping year where we start to set that out quite clearly, quite transparently, get some definitions on the table that we can all, you know, get around and feed into, and then start to identify what's the point where we think that's definitely a poor practice. What does bad look like as much as what does good look like, was the language that was used last week, because knowing both is going to be really useful.
Thank you so much, Luis, Julia, and Leda, for your answers and insights regarding sand and silicate. Like I mentioned, we need to allow time to answer questions from the audience, so I will continue with the agenda, and with that in mind, we can now shift our focus to practical next steps. So these are what actions can companies, standards, and stakeholders take starting now to get ahead of these issues and support the development of responsible sand and silicate sourcing. So this slide outlines the few clear steps that companies can begin taking immediately to start addressing the ESG risk associated with sand and silicate materials in their supply chain. So firstly, map and monitor your use of sand. It might not be obvious. Sand can be embedded in the production of solar panels, glass, electronics, construction materials, and even sometimes in packaging. Knowing where it shows up is the first step. And secondly, identify and assess the ESG risks. So where is the sand coming from? Is it being extracted from vulnerable ecosystems? Are there governance or human rights red flags? These are some of the questions that you can ask yourself. Third, begin to mitigate the risks. That could mean reviewing supplier practices, revising procurement criteria, or joining sector-wide initiatives like the Coalition for Responsible Sourcing of Sand and Silicates that Luis just presented. And finally, and I guess this is the key of these practical steps, don't wait for perfect guidance to emerge. The governance landscape is evolving. It is slowly, but it's evolving. So it's important that you act now regarding the position of your organization as a leader, and that you can strengthen your credibility with regulators, investors, and communities. Responsible sourcing of sand in the end is not just an environmental issue, it's a business resilience and ethics issue, and every actor across the value chain has a role to play. I hope the practical steps we've outlined have given our audience a clearer sense of where to begin and where they can contribute as well. So now we're moving into the Q&A portion of today's session. Many of you submitted very thoughtful questions when registering. Thank you so much for that. And also part of the audience have been sending some great questions. First question is, what role do large industrial consumers such as solar PV manufacturers, battery makers, or infrastructure contractors play in driving responsible sourcing, and what are the most impactful actions they can take now to influence upstream practices? I wonder who would like to, maybe Julia?
I mean, I can definitely jump in from the SSI perspective, as our members are obviously solar PV manufacturers as well as, buyers. And I think one of the, I would say, the key initial actions which already is happening is creating joint initiative where they can use together sort of their leverage as well as set of uniform requirements as they're approaching the upstream. Because that's definitely, even though everybody still needs to do their own due diligence and everybody still has specifics to their supply chain, definitely having uniform set of requirements and approach, how you do responsible sourcing, and using that as a sort of a combined message which comes to upstream is really good, starting step in the beginning.
Thank you so much, Julia. I have one for Luis here. It says, can you share any insights from the OECD closed door session about consensus or divergence among participants on what responsible sourcing of sand and silicates should look like, and what challenges remain in standardizing expectations across industries and geographies?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned already that this is going to be some of the detailed work to be done. There wasn't so much divergence in the sense of people saying we don't need to do that. There was definitely a convergence on that point. It was just a recognition that this is not going to be solved by some kind of global standard. It's going to be figured out place by place, experience by experience. The other thing that came up at that session, and maybe it responds to one of the questions on the fact that there's so many initiatives out there currently trying to get to grips with topics like this or connected to this material. So that was probably the biggest divergence was showing on the wall when we mapped out everything, just how many initiatives are out there, and how not any single one initiative is doing a great job for us right now in this material. Julia, you mentioned earlier, like this material has fallen between the cracks of a lot of existing initiatives, and that's where the gaps are being created, where you're rightfully coming in to fill that because it's needed. There is an overwhelm out there. There is a need on the due diligence side that's starting to grow. It needs to be met. So what I would say is the alignment is probably the next big challenge we have to face. We've already begun that alignment work by working with the existing supply chain due diligence standards of the OECD and starting to adapt those. They are flexible. We're working on that. The commitment to responsible sand and silicates, we have to work out in good detail, and then working out the performance, I think, is going to depend on the existing network or structure of what's out there. IRMA will do a good job for large mines, particularly underground mines. There's scope within it potentially for doing supplements on sand and silicates. They just don't exist yet. So that maybe corresponds to some of the questions here on gaps too. So yeah, we have been talking to IRMA. They have been at our meetings. We've been talking to plenty of different standards that are out there. And this is part of the need of a place to come together and work it out collaboratively.
Another question there in relation about existing international standards which have already been developed, and then why we are not approaching those, and IRMA was mentioned as one of them, and I think Luis already touched upon it from the coalition perspective. I did want to also mention from SSI perspective, because from the outset our approach was set very much on no need to reinvent the wheel and then capitalize on already existing programs. That's why when SSI created their ESG standard, we didn't decide to create yet another mining standard for quartz, while there is, and everybody who follows minerals and metal space knows that there are so many standards. It's like a jungle. They grow like mushrooms in the forest, all of these different standards, while we focused on the manufacturing side of things, where there was this gap for the solar PV sector. While we are looking into recognition of a mining standard or program who had been requiring quartz mining. And definitely IRMA is one of among those standards, which we are looking into and also had some initial discussions about it, but where we need to see how to capture the gap if we end up and our members end up seeing that upstream of their supply chain, there is not necessarily large scale quartz mining, but much more smaller and artisanal scale mining, which are then outside of IRMA scope, and which other type of program or standard we could look into to see that we are covering that part of the supply chain.
Thank you so much, Julia, for complementing this, and also it addresses one of the questions regarding IRMA that we receive. I do have a question for Leda next. So Leda, there seems to be no problems when you deal with local suppliers in terms of environment and putting people first, but problems arise when you have others from further afield joining downstream and start mining silicates. How can you have one cure for all due diligence?
In short, I don't think you can. Yeah, the OECD guidelines tell us to address the risks, and the risks are different in different supply chains. So as much as I would love to have a cure-all, the way we do it is to attack each risk individually, right? And I think the best way, when it is so far from our own operations and even from our own sphere of influence, the best way for us to attack that risk is often through a multi-stakeholder organisation like the SSI, or to support other collaborative initiatives that will enhance transparency in those supply chains, because we are so far removed from some of those, particularly the product scenario where we purchase an end product to install in a power plant, and that has involved sand and silicates in its production. So I think that's very real. But the guidance and the kind of the way you do it, the how, whilst the details vary, the approach is the same. It's been outlined in the OECD guidelines. So I think that for us is not reinventing the wheel either. We simply follow the same OECD guidelines, and we try to attack each of those risks in the best way. But yeah, leverage plays a big part of that analysis, right? Because even if we see that there's a big environmental risk in a particular supply chain, if we're very, very far removed from it and cannot hope to influence it as a tiny little customer of a product at the end, then we wouldn't seek to. It would be a waste of everybody's time and energy. So yeah, no cure-all, but there is very, very good standard best practice around the OECD guidelines, and we simply try to make sure we do a good job of identifying and assessing the risks, because that part of the wheel, if you like, for companies is really critical in being able to prioritise. So I think that's for sure where to focus your energies, so that you can take the most painless approach to the overwhelming challenge.
Thank you, Leda. This opens a question that I found here on the list that I think is a correct one. Is for Luis, and says, can the OECD guidelines developed in the global north work for the global south, and if there are any gaps?
Yeah, of course there are gaps. They're, like I mentioned earlier, they're pretty sensible, but everything's in the doing, you know, the practical action will be the place where you have to confront the challenges like Leda's just described, you know, and do your best. I understand them to be applicable in the global south, that you're going to have particular issues and emphasis that are different. I know there was one earlier question from the audience relating to ASM, but like the guidelines are trying to make provisions for situations of artisanal mining and informal mining where, you know, they have a clear statement: don't disengage, engage and lift the standards as, of those supply chains. Find the responsible ASM. We know it can exist. That's the work of EPRM. That's the work of the craft code, Marcin and team. So it's just finding that and lifting it. So I think they opened the door to doing better. You know, they're not going to solve every problem for you. You're going to have to figure that out in context. For me, I found them a good starting point. Let's put it that way. Whether that be in global north or global south, I think it's a good starting point. But you have to flavor it with the local context and what can be done. in place.
Thank you so much. Just mindful of the time, I will add one more question for Julia. It says, has any mapping or listing of quartz mines and polysilicon producing factories been undertaken in China?
So I think I will comment to this obviously from the SSI perspective, because this is one of the activities which is sort of needs to happen within SSI system, because the supply chain traceability standard, which was launched end of last year, requires our manufacturer members to actually to be able to get certified. They need to understand and be able to know where the raw materials are coming from, and they need to know it all the way to the polysilicon if they are aiming for the lower level of the certification, and all the way to quartz mines for the higher level certification. So in order to be able to meet those commitments, they would need to be able to map all their supply chain all the way, and then look into what is happening and where their suppliers are, also in particular in China. So this is also the activity, underway as we are planning to start our first traceability certifications at the end of Q3.
Thank you for that information. Thank you for answering the questions, and thank you to the audience for sending such insightful questions. We receive a lot of them. With that, I think we'll close our Q&A session there. Thank you very much to everyone again. And as we come to the end of our webinar, I would like to thank our speakers and the audience for their insight and participation. And I think, Luis, you wanted to add a few of remarks and useful resources.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Clara. Yeah, so maybe we could finish with a little bit of sharing the mood from Barcelona last week. I think what we came out of with all our partners was the sense of let's get started. We can't wait for perfection. I think that message was a good one from earlier. We can figure this out, and we can figure it out if we're working together. We do have the possibility to do something next generation here, learning about the voluntary initiatives that have gotten us where we are today, learning from them, but then building on from that. And that's really the spirit that the coalition is operating in. You'll see the links on the screen here. Have a look and see what the coalition is all about. You can, if it's to your taste, if it's something that you think is going to help you solve problems, by all means sign up for updates. You'll have a link here to follow. And also I'm completely open networker, so you'll find me on LinkedIn. If ever you'd like to just have a one-to-one, have a chat to see how this might relate to you, I'm very happy to help you with that. Okay, thank you, everybody.
So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you again to our speakers, Luis, Leda, and Julia. You have our contacts there on the screen, and we'll see you on the next webinar.